This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Emanuel Derman. He is a South African-born academic, businessman, and writer, best known as a quantitative analyst. His books include My Life as a Quant, Reflections on Physics and Finance, also Models Behaving Badly, former Goldman Sachs, Columbia professor. He has a wide range of experiences. A fun conversation, an interesting guy. I hope you enjoy. Emanuel, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Michael?
I'm not too bad. Hey, I'm not sure if he's an acquaintance of yours or not, but a professor at Columbia was on my show recently, Alex Gracerman.
I've never met him. I know who he is.
Okay. It's a small world and a big world all at the same time, right?
Yeah. He teaches we have two sort of math finance, financial engineering programs. I think he teaches in the other one. I've often heard students mention him, but I don't think I've ever met him.
Well, listen, we can cover a lot of topics today, and I'll try and throw a lot of different things at you. And you have a lot of different views and opinions on things that are fun and interesting. And when I reached out to you, and I guess we can start with this, I reached out to you, and you were asked by a publication to give a comment on this book, Capital in the 21st Century, I believe it's called. And you didn't really offer a view on it. You took it as an opportunity to offer some feedback on economists. And I want to give a quick quote just to give a flavor of your view that was published, and I'm sure you're going to expand on it. But you talked about that the public arguments of economists often have an incestuous yet masturbatory quality that's exhausting to follow. The only field more self-confidently but just as regularly wrong as economics is nutrition. Boy, that's just laying down the gauntlet, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, although I've actually once wrote something not quite as inflammatory, but in a blog when I used to blog on wilmot.com years ago. But I think it's true. I mean, I was careful thinking about masturbatory and incestuous, but I think it's right. It's incestuous because they're actually all very closely related to each other and yet having a passionate relationship with each other, which is sort of a characteristic of incest. And it's masturbatory in that it never gets resolved. It's sort of fruitless. You read Paul Krugman or you read John Cochrane. They're always battling. They write the same things over and over again and never convince each other.
Before we even get into the subject of the book, which I know you stated in the article that you had not read, your point really was you didn't even want to get into the debate because you felt like the people that are the debaters, the people that are pushing forth the argument and their research, their homework behind it is not even worth the time because it's so wildly different across so many different views.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true of Piketty. I mean, I know Piketty. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. People say Piketty. I haven't read his book. I've read reviews of it. I said I don't really want to spend 600. So the trouble with a lot of books is you can condense them in one line in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to read it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if inequality has increased. I don't really have anything against his book. I've just got a bad feeling. I mean, economics dominates the daily newspapers and the talk shows and the op-eds so violently that I've heard other people say too, I just don't feel like reading another book. I don't think Piketty himself irritates me. It's just the class of endless argument. And it's like nutrition in the sense that they're very scathing about each other. I know I'm simplifying. They're very scathing about each other, but they're never able to convince each other.
I saw you make a comment in an interview. You said something to the effect of engineering, chemistry can be value free. It is what it is. Economics, I saw you define as, we might as well be calling it a moral science. Why don't you explain your thought process there?
Yeah, I like that. I think, economics, I've never studied economics in my life. I'm a novice. I I went to school in South Africa, which is like a British system where you major in whatever you're going to major right away, undergraduate. So I did sciences from the age of 16 and a half. I learned finance on the job when I came to Goldman Sachs in 1985. Somebody gave me the Black-Scholes, actually the Cox-Ross-Rubenstein and Black-Scholes model to read, and then threw me in feet first. So I come late to economics. But in my youth, people who studied economics, they did PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. And if you look at Black-Scholes, I think it's originally published in the Journal of Political Economy or something like that. And economics wasn't always so mathematical. It was. I don't have my Guardian article about Piketty in front of me, but I said something like, economics is about how to spend limited resources to achieve what people think is worthwhile achieving, and that's a kind of moral decision. It's not a mathematical decision. The mathematics is a technique, but it takes some bigger view of the world and some agreement to decide, or maybe disagreement in the end, about what's actually worth doing. Am I answering your question? I'm not sure.
Well, and I think what you're really getting at, too, is that economics is it's being positioned as something that it's not. There's always going to be a human or a moral element, as you say. It's not just a formula that you let run. If it was, there wouldn't be such a massive disagreement out there.
Right. I can't put it better than that. But that's sort of actually not from Piketty and not from Darren Asimoglu, whom I actually met. I gave a talk somewhere in Germany about a month ago, and he gave a talk on what makes nations fail. And that's sort of, as best as I could understand, in the more classical economic framework, although he told me that he actually started out as a very mathematical economist, and you sort of had to do that.
When you decided to give the opinion on the Piketty work, were you in the back of your mind also sharing or having a belief on his basic premise?
I don't question his basic premise, but just intuitively, I think it's probably likely. It's likely to be true. I was really, in some sense, I was just ranting against the state of economic discourse and using him as a crutch. I haven't read his book, as I said in that article, and I suspect what he says is right. But he became, I don't know, every few months or every few years, there's this craze about some book, and he was the current one. I think I tweeted one day, I can't remember what was before that. At one point, it was Michael Lewis's book, which I actually did read. Forget what it's called now. Do you know which one I mean? The last one.
Yeah, I get a kick how you think about this stuff. I sometimes feel the same way, is that there's so much information, you take it in, and sometimes books, and I even look at some of my books like this, sometimes it's really one great idea is all it is,
Yes. If you don't want to read, a lot of books can be summarized in a short space.
Let me take you back a few years. I think you have some opinions on this subject as well. And I still talk to people about it. It's still, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but it still bothers me to this day that all 4 of the U.S. investment banks were not allowed to go by the wayside.
Yeah, I'm horrified at what happened. I argue a lot with friends what happened in the bailout, in the sense that if capitalism is going to make sense for anybody, it's a brutal business, but the idea is you pay your money, or you make your bets and you take the results. And that didn't happen. We bailed out. Who are you talking about specifically?
Well, I mean, we went down the line. Bayer disappeared, and Lehman Brothers disappeared, and then we got to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and they kind of said the line in the sand.
Yeah, they were about to disappear. I actually went to a sort of ex-Goldman People's Party shortly after that. And people were saying that they were really scared that weekend. They were planning, they were expecting the end, And I think it was the Fed or the Treasury went in and made them a bank holding company and literally saved their bacon. People say, and I think it's right, that they didn't own junk the way maybe Merrill or eventually Bank of America did. But still, even if you go down for systemic reasons, as opposed to your bad decisions, that's still one of the risks that you knew about and took. Mm. And I don't think you deserve to be saved, and not at public expense.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty straightforward opinion. I happen to share it. I think a lot of other wise people share it as well, too. Let me get you to go back in time, though. So ultimately you get your PhD in theoretical physics. You had that before you started at Goldman?
Oh yeah, I have a roundabout route. I got a PhD in 1973, and actually, unlike a lot of the physicists on Wall Street, I actually worked for 7 years afterwards as a physicist doing research. So from 73 to 80, I was a postdoc in various places in University of Pennsylvania, and then in Oxford, and then at Rockefeller University in New York. And then I was an assistant professor. Am I getting too long-winded here?
No, not at all.
Okay, then I was assistant professor at University of Colorado at Boulder, which was a very nice place. But my wife was in academic life too, in biology, and we were always moving in different places. And we had a small kid already. My son was born in England. And I sort of threw the towel in. I got kind of tired of the whole thing. It was getting too hard to find a job where you wanted. And I was getting a bit disillusioned in general. So I went to work at Bell Labs, which was what Wall Street is now was for physicists. In 1980, Bell Labs, and actually the energy industry, Exxon labs were the places where technical people went when they couldn't get university jobs anymore. So I went there for 5 years. And then I came to Goldman in 1985.
So now you would have been at the front line of physicists being hired onto Wall Street. I mean, you were right there at the beginning stages of that.
Close to the beginning, but not absolutely. I interviewed in 83 when I was at Bell Labs. I came away at Goldman, and I didn't take a job. And then 2 years later, I kind of had enough, and I did. But there were people there already, I would say, from the very late 70s or early 80s in a small amount.
By the time, having been at Bell Labs and then going to Goldman, you were well aware of what Goldman was. You were not kind of just new to the idea of Wall Street and whatnot. You're like, okay, I know how my experience can benefit myself going to this investment bank. You knew as you were taking that position. It wasn't, I've talked to some folks that actually have gone in with your type of background and they really were like, well, just tell me that I didn't know anything.
I wasn't as knowledgeable as you say. I was at Bell Labs for 5 years in what they called a business analysis systems center or business systems analysis center. I can't quite remember. It was sort of it was a lot of ex-scientists already doing other stuff, mostly computerish. But I didn't know that much about Wall Street. I learned a little bit of finance. They sent me once to an MIT sort of exec ed course for 2 weeks, where I learned a little bit about the capital asset pricing model, but didn't really understand it. I went to Wall Street more because I'd had it with Bell Labs. And I was sitting there the whole time for several years thinking, should I try to go back to physics academic life, which was really hard because I wanted to stay in New York. And I wasn't even sure if I could get a job, and I would sort of had to go back a bunch of career steps, or jump all the way out of the ivory tower, which Bell Labs was partially, and go to Wall Street. And you were getting lots of calls from Wall Street headhunters in those days. They were fishing, dropping their bait in Bell Labs, and eventually I gave in. Not sure what I was in for, really.
Well, that's kind of where I was going to go. So you have an idea of what Goldman Sachs is and perhaps how your skills might be used, and then you get there. What were some of the feelings, experiences that you can talk about early on that perhaps were the real eye opener about what you were in the middle of?
Yeah, it was actually, I almost feel a little bad saying it, but it was actually quite wonderful because I felt like a real trader leaving physics in 1980 and leaving things that I liked. And Bell Labs, I was kind of unhappy for 5 years, almost from the moment I got there. Maybe I'd been unhappy anywhere I would have gone after being in physics, but Bell Labs was the place, and it was very bureaucratic. It was part of AT&T. They had 1 million people. There were literally a staff of 1 million people. There was an incredible bureaucracy in which, every 4 members of technical staff worked for a supervisor. Every 4 supervisors worked for a department head. Every 4 department heads worked for whatever it was. And everybody was asking permission all the time for everything. And coming from physics, I was used to sort of thinking, I'm going to live or die by my own skill, not be part of a big bureaucracy. And so when I came to Goldman, this is in 1985, there were maybe 5 or 6 or 7,000 people there. It was large already, but nothing like now. it was actually very entrepreneurial in a good way. I was doing research. I wasn't really a market person. I wasn't a trader. I wasn't a salesman. They had a very intellectual environment, at least for people like me. And in addition, unlike at Bell Labs, maybe this sounds counterintuitive, but at Bell Labs, I always had the feeling that everybody wanted to be a supervisor and they were going to climb over your back to become one. And what people really respected, except for a few isolated counterexamples, what people respected was the ability to be a manager. And when I came to Goldman, if you're a geek, if you're a programmer, if you could solve differential equations, you might be sort of a little weird, but you got paid not badly and people kind of respected you. So it was actually, I got very excited coming there. I got a real shot in the arm. I write in my book that I used to go up and down on the subway to work reading Cox and Rubenstein on options markets and feeling like I had something to learn and something to contribute.
Well, let's break apart, one of your great lines, My Life as a Quant, the title of your book too. Why don't you break apart model building and your model building at Goldman Sachs, the good and bad of it? Pick a way to kind of let the audience, look, some of my audience is inexperienced, some of them are very experienced, and perhaps your peers. But why don't you just describe the idea of model building and how you were indoctrinated to model building and the types of models that you were building?
That is a big question. I'm trying to think how to work my way into it. But I came there, and as I said, the first thing somebody did was throw Cox-Ross-Rubenstein model, binomial model at me, asked me to read it, and then start fixing a program that didn't work, that had some errors in it. Well, first of all, I'm trying to think. First of all, I worked very closely with traders. The research group I was in worked very closely with traders who actually used these models. So I liked it because it was a bit like being a theoretical physicist where you work closely with experimentalists, which is what I had done in my previous life, the traders being the experimentalists.
You could apply it right there.
Yeah, it was very nice because God knows if it's ethically justifiable. I ran into people who cursed me at the time when I said I was working on Wall Street. But you actually worked on a model, and it was iterative, and there was lots of interaction. You started doing something, a trader would try it, they would give you some feedback. They knew what the actual financial problem was better than you did. So that part was very exciting. It was like a collaboration between people using it and people trying to understand how to make something that would work for them. They understood the markets, you understood the math better, and maybe the modeling. One of the things that became very clear to me at the time and was that user interface was very important. I had a background from Bell Labs in building user interfaces and building not just Fortran programs, but real Unix sort of trading systems. And one of the things that became very clear to me was that what mattered a lot for a model was not just the extra math or the extra finance or the extra computer science or statistics. It was an interdisciplinary mix of all of those, but that the ergonomics was very important. The first thing I did was replace a very old-fashioned model that didn't have a screen at all, and you had to enter all the data line by line in a question and answer way. This was a long time ago in 1985. And I built from scratch. I knew how to do it. There were no spreadsheets in those days. I built a screen that moved the cursor around and asked the user, enter the coupon, enter the maturity date, enter the option expiration, maturity date for the bond, and then saved all that information so that if he came back the next day, he could look at the same trade and try to analyze it again if they hadn't done it yet. And I suddenly realized how important the software environment is in addition to the model. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I just, sometimes it's just you just want to get inside folks' minds, have them relay some experiences. I think that's what the audience enjoys. The audience enjoys just hearing people, how they walked their path. So there's nothing you're going to say that's going to be boring. You've had an interesting career. You know that. Okay.
I like the mix of theory and software. And I think it was very important. And actually, when I ran groups later, I didn't like to separate the so-called information technology part from the quantitative financial part. I liked one person who could do both of those. And that's where I grew up, doing my own dirty work. that's the way I sort of lived for most of the time I was on Wall Street. And these things go in phases, actually. Then somewhere around the late 90s, that changed, and the IT people and the quant people became separate, the thinkers and the developers. But I think it's gone the other way again now with algorithmic trading and trading systems. There's been a unification of those skills in one person again. And I think that's good. It makes for a much more interesting life as well.
I start this conversation off letting you compare economics to perhaps other sciences. One of the things that you've also done, though, too, is compare finance models to physics models. And look, I can think of people in my world having written some books about the style of trading called trend following, and many of these traders today, and I understand why they do it, and it makes perfect sense to me, are coming at in their public and private announcements from a scientific method standpoint. They're describing their methods in science terms. I can think of two traders, one running about a $25 billion fund and one running about a $5 billion fund. Combined, they got pretty good money. They're unrelated, but the reason I bring it up is that Goldman Sachs owns 10% of each of them. And so I'm curious if you would break apart, because I've got some other points here, but why don't you break apart big picture wise the notion of the financial model and science and just the physics model and science?
I like to say that finance and physics have the same syntax, but not the same semantics. In that, if you look at a finance paper and a physics paper, the finance paper looks much more formal than most physics papers these days. Everybody in economics writes, I can talk about that later, writes in the strange mathematical axiomatic style. But the semantics is different, even though they both use maths and you might naively confuse one for the other. It's very different. In physics, you actually have equations that accurately describe the world to a very high degree of accuracy and predict the future. And most financial models don't predict the future. That's not the way people in the trading world use them. They usually take a model and calibrate it to liquid current prices and then use it to estimate in the present the value of less liquid things. People really predict the future. They rather try to figure out what illiquid things are worth given the price of liquid things. That's what Black-Scholes really does for you. It tells you if you know the price of a short-term bond, interest rates, in other words, and if you know the price of a stock, it'll tell you roughly what the price of an option should be. So it's always going from the present to the present, not from the present to the future. So that's one big semantic difference. Secondly, it just doesn't work as well. A lot of finance is really glorified interpolation. That's not an insult. It's just a fact. In the way that I described, you're trying to go from liquid known fungible prices to illiquid values and estimate them. That doesn't work badly as long as the world stays in the same sort of state as you're in when you calibrated the model. But when trouble comes, all bets are off. Your models don't really work. I kind of like to say that all financial models, at least of the kind that I worked on, are really short volatility in the sense that when volatility increases, they're going to do badly.
Well, that's an interesting point because I was thinking about, for example, Nassim Taleb and Mark Spitznagel, and thinking about the trend following world, my world. It's a lot of long volatility. When you think about models, though, is it your experience, the short volatility models is where you really have the issue, or do you also look at the long volatility models and say, I've got some concerns there as well?
No, I was actually talking. Well, I think both. I was just saying, in a way that whether you build long vol models or Taleb, I'm stepping aside, Taleb and Spitznagel, I think, are less building models than just saying it'd be smart to be long volatility, not short volatility, because when trouble comes, you'll make money if you own out of the money options. I think they're not really building structural models in the sense that, say, Black-Scholes is or something like that. But what I was trying to say is if you're a long vol or if you're a trend follower, that's good as long as the world stays fairly calm. But hidden inside there in the market, there's something that's making you short vol because if you get a big increase in volatility, your model is probably going to be wrong. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no. I was thinking from a trend following perspective, changes in volatility. Look, nobody can predict the future, and I think it's how I'm very interested in your view of finance models compared to physics models. And I guess I was just curious the types of models that you were specifically thinking of when you started to go down this comparison between the two.
I was thinking of CAPM, efficient markets, Black-Scholes, almost any of the models that I face every day, although I mostly come from a derivatives world, not from at least when I worked on Wall Street, not from an asset management world.
But the big issue for you ultimately, and if we just break this down to simple terms, how does one estimate risk?
Yeah, I think I'm trying. Let me go back to what I was saying before,
Sure.
And then I'll come back to that. But in physics, for some wonderful reason, okay, in this book I wrote called Models Behaving Badly, I tried hard to distinguish epistemologically somehow between the idea of a theory and a model. And I said theories are things that really try to describe the world the way it is. So, for example, in Newton's laws, you say force equals mass times acceleration, and there's nothing relative about that. You say that's the way the world is. You may be right, you may be wrong, but that's what Newton says. And so physics has two classes of attempts to understand the natural world. One is theories, where they say something like force equals mass times acceleration, which is just a statement about the way somebody thinks the world works, and it actually does. And then the other one so that's an absolute model, an absolute statement, and I call that a theory. And a model is more of an analogy, where you say the nucleus is like a liquid drop of water. That's not an absolute statement, that's a relative statement. What you're saying is, for example, you can think of the nucleus of an atom as a vibrating, rotating drop of water. And somebody actually got the Nobel Prize for that model because it works pretty well. But everybody in physics understands that saying the nucleus, it's called the liquid drop model of the nucleus. Everybody in physics understands that that's a model, but that Newton's laws are a theory. And what makes it a model is that it's making a comparison between something you understand and something you don't. I don't think finance has any theories. If you look at efficient market models or Black-Scholes, finance models are saying stock prices behave like smoke diffusing, or like Brownian motion, like dust particles bumping around, being bumped by atoms in a room. And those are analogies, and they're insightful, but they're not true. They're not true in the way that Newton's laws are true. So they break down at some point. And I don't think finance has any real absolute theories that are correct. So, for example, coming back to what you said about risk, at least the traditional sort of modern portfolio theory measures risk as the standard deviation of returns. And that would be the real risk if stocks really did behave like particles of dust being bumped around under Brownian motion, but they don't. It's not a bad model. It's not a bad analogy to give you a feel for what things are like, but it's actually not true. No, I think that's the big difference between physics and finance, is that physics somehow has this ability, because it's dealing with inanimate objects, to write down something that works pretty well, and finance can really only make analogies that ultimately fail.
You know, right now, at this point of your career, you're in the academic community again. So, those are pretty strong statements. Do you find a significant amount of pushback from others in the academic community when you say things so bluntly as you just did? Or do they kind of go, oh shit, don't say that, because we know it's true, but
yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think people who work on Wall Street on trading desks agree with what I'm saying, and I've heard people say similar stuff. I worked for Bob Lutzenberger at one point, and he certainly felt similarly. I think everybody understands that on Wall Street, and good traders understand that. And I think people at Goldman understand that, which is why they didn't lose a lot of money. They maybe should have gone down because the whole system was going to go down, but they didn't go down out of buying bad securities. But academics most of the academics I've met have a very bad mental model of the way people use models. And I think they don't understand what I was saying. They tend to teach economics and finance in a very mathematical way with axioms and theorems and lemmas, and don't really worry about whether that's true or not. They don't understand how sloppily but intelligently people use models in a trading environment.
It struck me, not having your background, but looking at a lot of different white papers, and sometimes some of them I just kind of glaze over. But you've made the comment, the idea that, finance papers often these days clearly look like science papers. And I saw you make the comment that it's almost a perversion of common sense. That's, the idea of human behavior being put into these formulas that resemble physics formulas is kind of maybe fooling ourselves, isn't it?
I think you have to I think if you want to work in this field intelligently, you have to be a little bit schizophrenic. You sort of have to, you can't avoid using mathematics, but you have to keep looking over your shoulder all the time and saying, I know this isn't really right. And I know it's going to break down because I'm describing people and markets which are driven by people, and they don't really work this way except for a small period of time or in a small range of environments, which may change at any instant. So I think you have to sort of keep being suspicious about everything you do, which I think academics don't do. They have this, I'm talking blanket terms, but they have this idea that you can write down something and just keep going, and that the world actually works that way. And if your model doesn't work, they somehow think somewhere out there is a holy grail model, and we're getting closer and closer to it. But I don't think that's the case at all, because the environment in which you use the models keeps changing, and even using a new model changes the environment, and you don't really get closer and closer to this. In physics, maybe you get closer and closer to the grand theory of everything. Maybe you don't, but at least you could plausibly argue that you do. But I think it's a mistake to think that way in finance.
When you talk to your students and you're talking about quantitative models, you want them to be able to explain them qualitatively as well too, huh?
Yes, I do. I think and I think that's something, well, I learned that in physics, but I learned it at Goldman too, that if you want to communicate with people who use these models but aren't as numerate as you are, it's very important to understand the model from an intuitive point of view, or from a visceral point of view. You don't just want to do a calculation and say this is the answer. You want to understand, preferably in advance, what the answer might look like and what are the important parts that enter. And that's when you really learn a lot. And I think that's, to some extent, the benefit of getting a PhD, which in itself doesn't mean that much. But I think, at least in physics, when you get a PhD, you have to go through a lot of hard struggle to not just derive equations, but understand what they mean in a qualitative way. And anyway, I try to impress that on the students, and they do it, but it's a hard job.
I was going to say, for some very bright teenage students, very bright math aptitudes, trying to explain to them why they need to spend their time also proving this qualitatively is probably sometimes they might look at you and go, why?
There are, finance, you can be a math genius at age 18, or you can be a chess genius at age 16 or 17 or 18. I think you can't be a physics genius that early, and you can't be a finance genius that early. It takes a lot more understanding of the world than just playing chess.
Yeah, fair point. Listen, Emanuel, I appreciate you coming on today. I just want to have a quick chat. I know you had some interesting perspectives. I'm up to close to 300 podcast episodes, and like I said, I'm sure many of the folks I've had on have been your peers. But I thought you had some really very strong, clear views about economics, finance, and a science such as physics, and kind of comparing and contrasting all three. And I think it's good food for thought for people just to stay grounded and keep their eyes wide open. As you say, keep looking behind you as well, too, and keep worrying and being a little skeptical that there could be a breakdown. Things might not go the way you expect, might not go the way that the formula dictates.
I think physics and finance are very different. I said before, they use the same language and they use some of the same skills, but the meaning of what they do is very different.
Yeah.
But I'm a bit sad about the way economics has gotten so mathematical, and even finance. It's gotten much more mathematical than physics in a way. People in physics, I said this in my book, but you write down equations and sometimes they're tremendously efficacious, even if you're not very formal, in the sense they really do explain things. And in finance, you can't get published these days unless you write very mathematical papers, and often they have no efficacy at all.
I mean, that's gotta be shocking for quite a few people to hear. I mean, you've got, it's not like you're a new guy on the block and you're just basically saying that, if I get back to your original descriptor that I pulled from that article, you basically just described a good portion of the field that are writing these finance papers as publishing mental masturbation. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like what you're saying.
It's all exaggerated a little bit. It doesn't apply to everybody, but I think it's true. And then the counterexample to that is behavioral economics. And I once wrote a column for a German newspaper. I'm kind of disappointed in behavioral economics too. I got very excited when I first started to learn about it because it seemed like what Kahneman and Tversky were going to do and what did set out to do, although I learned it much later, was to explain people's anomalous, mistaken intuitions about risk in a mathematical way. So they don't like losses. They're willing to do anything to cover their losses, even irrationally. And they try to describe all this in prospect theory. And it looked really the right way to go, to try to sort of build the mathematics of the way people actually behave rather than the way efficient markets assume. But I think it's gotten kind of perverted. When I look at behavioral finance now too, a lot of the articles are about gender issues in CEOs. If I Googled for a minute, I would find my article that I wrote. But they just, if you look at the SSRN newsletter of behavioral economics, so many of the articles are about, whether the stock markets do worse the day after they lose a game in the World Cup.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I'm not making these things up. Or CEOs' gender studies, or small market anomalies. They're sort of mildly interesting, but you get the feeling that they don't amount to a whole discipline in the way that classical economics did, or even efficient markets. And that people are sort of just digging around for things to publish. Doing something similar to what somebody else did before in a slightly different case so they can have an article.
It's a great point. I sometimes look at behavioral economics and finance and I say, well, gosh, it's like grasping for straws to come up with an example for this particular week, month, or year. Whereas maybe the original guys, as you mentioned, had some innovative and novel thought. But today it does seem like people are reaching.
Yeah. I mean, classical, or whatever you call it, classical portfolio theory or efficient market, it's not strictly correct, but there's something comprehensive and attractive about it. And behavioral economics started out that way too, but I think it's gone astray. And it's gone astray in another way too, in that it's become a political tool, in the sense that the people who are using so-called behavioral economics a lot are really
politicians.
Yeah, Richard Thaler, I believe, was head of behavioral economists for Obama. They're trying to, so the people who are using it are advertisers and politicians or political manipulators, both in the business of manipulation, trying to portray politicians to you depending on what you clicked on last, trying to show you that part of the politician that would appeal to you if you're that kind of person. Am I making sense? So they look at your profile on the web, and if you're one kind of person, they'll show you one side of the political person they want you to vote for candidate. If you're on another, if you've clicked on other things, they'll show you something different. And I don't think that's a great way to run a democracy. I was sort of used to growing up in South Africa where there were big issues, and you look to politicians to lead you rather than to follow. Now they seem to want to figure out what is it you want, and then I'll pretend to be that, as opposed to people like Obama or actually Gorbachev or de Klerk who got one step ahead of history by trying to figure out how to get to a non-violent solution rather than trying to figure out what people want and say, I'll give it to you, or I'll pretend to give it to you.
Yeah, but I think you probably, I guess if we really were to get scientific about politicians, we could probably all argue, regardless of political stripe, left, right, center, they all kind of work from the same playbook. Yeah.
I wasn't criticizing one particular, I wasn't criticizing one particular one. I was sort of more saying there's a style of politics now which is to sort of lead from behind rather than from in front.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's all about polling and what is your particular view, as you mentioned, and just trying to deliver the flavor of the week and make somebody happy for that moment in time. But there's very little of that stand up, this is the right direction, this is the way we need to go. Look, a great example, I know you're probably up in the New York area. I mean, would we ever build the Brooklyn Bridge today? Of course not.
Oh my God, that's so depressing. I live in Manhattan, and I remember when the West Side Highway fell down when I still worked at Bell Labs, and I had to drive that way every day in the 80s. And nobody's ever rebuilt it,
Yeah, I mean, you can't. There's getting things done has become so protracted, and that's a whole different subject. We could go on there, but listen, I appreciate you coming on because you've got a really wide perspective, and I think it's fun to kind of take these different disciplines, connect them together, contrast them, kind of pull them apart, and you've seen it and lived it. So I appreciate you coming on today. Hey, where's the best place? People can check out your books on Amazon, but your best website to send people to, where should we send them to?
I have a website called www.emanuelderman.com, which has a lot of the stuff, not easily accessible, but it's all there. I want to clean it up. I have these two books, Models Behaving Badly, which is the later one, and My Life as a Quant, which are both available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble as ebooks or as hardcover. And I actually wrote a lot of, I actually have, if somebody's interested, I wrote a lot of columns for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung at one point for about a year and a half related to some of these things. And I've got them all in an ebook together with some short stories called Bad Behavior on Amazon. And it's got a lot of general sort of short articles about this kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, absolutely. People can go grab your books and dig a little bit deeper on some of your life experiences. We can only touch on so much in 45 minutes. And it's our first time talking. So sometimes if you get some slightly crazy guy calling you from Asia, peppering you with questions, you got to kind of stop and pause for a second and say, where do I want to take this? Yeah, I understand the feeling.
No, I enjoyed this. I didn't know much about it before, but it was very interesting.
Hey, Emanuel, thanks again. And hopefully maybe we can catch up again in the near future. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.